this first day of summer or spring, whatever it is, but it's delightful weather. My name is Ken Yalowitz, the director of the Nicky Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening on behalf of the Rockefeller Center and also the History Department, all of which are co-sponsoring tonight's events. I'll be turning over the program in just a moment to Professor Bruce Nelson from the History Department, but I just simply wanted to use this opportunity to extend a very warm welcome to Bob and Jerry Dallek. Jerry and Bob have really made themselves an integral part of Dartmouth over the last several years as Montgomery Fellows, as visiting professors, and they're absolutely wonderful people. And I just could not be more pleased and more proud of Bob and his success. And so as I say, it's a very special occasion personally to welcome them here tonight. But I'd like to ask Professor Bruce Nelson to formally introduce our speaker. Bruce?
Well, Ken has already stolen a couple of my lines, but that's okay. We'll muddle through. And I want to say also that it is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Robert Dallek and Jerry Dallek also back to Dartmouth. I say back to Dartmouth because he is hardly a stranger to us. On the contrary, he has served as a Montgomery Fellow twice in recent years, for the entire summer of 2004 and more briefly for a week in the summer of 2005. He has taught courses on the presidency in both the history and the government departments, most recently in the fall of 2005. Robert Dallek was born and raised in Brooklyn, that's New York, not Maine. After graduating from high school, he followed Horace Greeley's injunction to go west, young man, and found his way to Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, where he intended to prepare himself for a career in dentistry. However, seeing the light, if not the money, he decided to change his major to history, and he graduated from the University of Illinois with high honors in history in 1955. Thereafter, he returned to New York City in order to pursue a graduate study in history at Columbia University, where he received his MA in 1957 and his PhD in 1964. Mr. Greeley apparently got to him again, though, because after completing his PhD at Columbia, he migrated all the way to Los Angeles, where for 30 years he had a distinguished career in the history department at UCLA. After retiring from UCLA in 1994, he served as the Harmsworth Visiting Professor of History at Oxford University in 1994-95, and as a visiting professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, University of Texas in the spring of 1996. Thereafter, he taught at Boston University from the fall of 1996 until 2003, when he retired again. But I think you will see that this is not a retiring kind of guy. 740 pages of retirement here. Professor Dallek is the author of numerous books, including Franklin D. Roosevelt and American Foreign Policy, which won the prestigious Bancroft Prize in 1980, including Ronald Reagan, The Politics of Symbolism, which was published in 1984, including his two-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson and his times, Lone Star Rising in 1991, and Flawed Giant, I should say the magisterial Flawed Giant, in 1998. And then in 2003, the best-selling An Unfinished Life, John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963. Amazingly enough, only 4 years later, yes, after the publication of An Unfinished Life, Bob has done it again. He has brought us Nixon and Kissinger, Partners in Power, only 653 pages of text. The index is long. But it has just been published by HarperCollins. So it should be clear by now that Robert Dallek exists to make other historians feel quite paltry about their own contribution to the profession by comparison. It should also be clear that he is a distinguished historian of the presidency and a biographer of presidents whose extraordinary record of publications speaks for itself. If I may offer a brief testimonial, I can report that I have read several of Bob's major publications, including his pioneering analysis of the Reagan presidency in mid-course, the Ronald Reagan, The Politics of Symbolism, and also Flawed Giant, the second volume of the Johnson biography. In that book in particular, I came to know Robert Dallek as a superb craftsman, an engaging storyteller, an astute analyst, and an indispensable resource for understanding a president who was larger than life, who was spectacularly successful and, yes, unsuccessful, and who was deeply flawed in ways that proved tragic for himself, for American society, and lest we forget, for the people of Vietnam. Now Bob has taken on two more larger-than-life and deeply flawed figures in Richard Nixon and his, I'll put it in quotes, co-president, Henry Kissinger. I received a complimentary copy of Nixon and Kissinger a few days ago, and I had the opportunity to read several chapters in it last night. Once again, I had the pleasure of discovering a gifted wordsmith, and I'm talking about Bob, not Nixon, a great storyteller, and an astute analyst who makes these two historical figures come alive in ways that are enlightening, exhilarating, and yes, terrifying. Please join me in welcoming Robert Dallek.
Bruce, thanks a million for that wonderful introduction. I can't resist telling this anecdote I've told many times before, but I'll repeat it anyway. When I get an introduction like this, I always think back to one I got a number of years ago in the Soviet Union. My host on that occasion, who I think had an imperfect command of English, introduced me by saying, Professor Dallek is the author of several distinguished works. They're the kinds of books that once you put them down, you can't pick them up again. Not music to the author's ears. I also like to begin these lectures by telling another anecdote that I love about my son, who's now 37, but when he was about 4 or 5 years old, he said to me one day, Daddy, he said, you're a doctor, aren't you? And I said, well, yeah, but not like your doctor, not like your pediatrician. He said, oh, I know that because you're also an historian. Well, I was delighted he could make this distinction at so tender an age. But then he wanted to know, does that mean that you make people in the past feel better? So, first, let me express my appreciation to Ken Yalowitz for arranging this, and for Bruce and the History Department, the Rockefeller Center, and really, my wife and I, Jerry and I, have a special feeling now for Dartmouth. We've spent 2 terms here and a little part of another, small part of another summer. And Susan Wright, who's in the audience, who runs this Montgomery Fellows program, is such a great asset, as Ken is, to this institution. And it really is such a wonderful college. It's just such a wonderful institute of higher education. And also, my good friend Jeffrey Hart is here. He and I got acquainted while I was up here, and we've now become great electronic correspondents. There's hardly a week that goes by that we don't issue declarations to each other about current events, and it's great fun. So, let me turn to the subject of the evening, Nixon and Kissinger, and begin by relating an anecdote about an experience I had when I was teaching in Oxford in 1994-95. During that year, the BBC asked me if I would come on the radio to debate an English scholar who was fiercely critical of Roosevelt and Churchill. And I felt unfairly so, that it was terribly overdrawn. And so he and I got on to the BBC together, and it really became a pretty fierce conflict. And we began arguing over who had read more documents about these two men, two scholars, you see. Who had read more documents? And he said, I could see him, though he was in Leeds and I was in Oxford, I could almost see him shaking his finger at me, why I've read more documents on this subject than you ever could possibly read. And so I replied to him, well, you remind me of what Harry Truman said about Richard Nixon. He may have read the Constitution, but he sure as hell didn't understand it. Was my best moment in a debate. What I was struck by in that debate, what I was reminded of, is the saying of the great Dutch historian Peter Geel that history is argument without end. That we debate these matters, these subjects, these presidents ad infinitum. And in part, I think it's because it's so difficult to get at the full story of what these men have done, these presidents have achieved and failed at. Because their impulse is to convince you that they walk on water. They don't want you to know the full story, the full truth. Certainly during their administrations, their press secretaries, their principal aides are going to provide a wealth of complimentary material to the press. And of course, these presidents always have a painfully adversarial relationship with the press because the press is trying to cut through the veneer of malarkey that these presidents are often putting out. And so, when I think back to the way in which presidents have tried to manipulate their public images, I remember an anecdote about Franklin Roosevelt, who during the Second World War, he was told that the State Department was going to publish the documentary records from the conversations at Versailles. And Roosevelt said, why are they doing that? In fact, he said, why were these documents created or made in the first place? He was so intent on manipulating his image and so determined to assure that he would come down to future generations as an extraordinary or great president. When I came to work on this Nixon and Kissinger book, I approached it with substantial doubts. Because Nixon, after all, had a reputation as being extraordinarily secretive. He didn't have the nickname Tricky Dick for nothing. See, there was the feeling on my part, will I possibly be able to penetrate the veneer of what these men were doing? And to my delight, and in some ways amazement, I found that this Nixon presidency is the most transparent of any in American presidential history. Why? Because they left behind a phenomenal body of material that allows you to reconstruct this presidential administration to a degree that I don't think we can provide for any other presidency. First of all, of course, there were the Nixon tapes. 3,700 hours. 3,700 hours of conversations. They were voice activated, unlike Johnson and Kennedy before him, who had conversations that they chose to tape. Johnson would sit in the Oval Office, and if a phone call came in that he wanted taped, he'd go like this to his secretary. See, run the tape. But Nixon was taping everything. Now, there are still 900 hours of those conversations that are closed. Not because the archives are trying to hide this material, but because the manpower required in order to vet them for national security concerns and for privacy concerns is still not available. But there are 2,700 hours, or 2,800 hours, I'm sorry, of Nixon tapes. Then, to my amazement, there are 20,000 pages of Henry Kissinger's telephone transcripts. He locked this material up in the Library of Congress till 5 years after he died. And then there was supposed to be a committee that was going to vet this material in order to decide who could get into them or not. The Historical Division in the State Department, a few years back, came to him and said, we are at a point that we must publish the volumes on the Nixon-Kissinger period in order to have authoritative volumes in this foreign relations series. It's a venerable, a great foreign relations series that goes back to 1869. In order to have a really proper set of volumes here, we must have your papers. They pressed him very hard. He caved in. and he turned over this material. What he did was to have a dead key on his phone, and somebody would listen in on these conversations, and they'd make notes, and then they would type up these transcripts. I was amazed that the kinds of things that he says that's in this material has been left behind for historians, to biographers to study, to use in the reconstruction of the Nixon-Kissinger White House. Indeed, this book, an excerpt of it was published by Vanity Fair, and it came to me on the grapevine through a few people that, because they cherry-picked and took out some of the, I guess, most negative stuff one could say about Kissinger, and it was reported to me that he was furious and livid, and I said he has every right to be livid against himself for having done some of the things he did, and also, most important, for having left behind all these documents so I could read them and then reconstruct this history. See? One of the things that historians of the future and biographers will puzzle over and struggle with is the question of why they leave this material to historians and biographers. Now, Nixon, these tapes, I don't think he ever believed they would see the light of day, except for what he chose to let out. But of course, Watergate came along and forced him into leaving these behind. And it's such a rich record. On top of that, we have now 800,000 pages of national security files. We have what's called the Al Haig Cron files. Haig became Nixon's chief of staff after Haldeman was booted out in '73 over Watergate. And we also have something called the H.R. Bob Haldeman diaries. There's a printed version of this. But in the archives, there's something called the CD-ROM version. And they left out of the printed version a lot of the things that were seen as too sensitive to publish at the time. But again, the fly on the wall, I could get in there and get at this material, and it made for what I felt was an extraordinary story. So, the question for tonight is, what did I learn? First of all, I would say, I saw that there was an extraordinary collaboration here. I don't think there's ever been quite such a collaboration in the management of foreign policy as this one between Nixon and Kissinger. You had Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, FDR and Harry Hopkins, Harry Truman and Dean Acheson, but no one matched what Kissinger did in relation to President Nixon. No one had as much authority, as much influence, as much involvement in the making of foreign policy as Kissinger. And I say at one point, this was really in some ways a co-presidency. And as I'll show you, when they got into Watergate, it became even more than that because of Nixon's incapacitation over the Watergate scandal. I think they achieved, in this collaboration, three great things, three very impressive diplomatic breakthroughs. First and foremost was China. It was Nixon who pioneered this idea that we could not allow a country of 800 million people to be isolated from us forever. We had to establish some kind of relationship with them. And he was the one to do it. Because if a Democratic president had tried to do it, it would have been, I think, a very difficult proposition. They would have been pilloried by their opponents as having taken a false step in the Cold War. But Nixon, who had been a fierce anti-communist and especially fiercely critical of the communist regime in China, was able to take this action. Secondly, Nixon and Kissinger understood that nuclear weapons were not really usable weapons. They believed in what was called MAD, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. You could not fight a nuclear war. And that one way or another, you had to arrive at some kind of détente with the Soviet Union. And so they were determined not only to open the way to relations with China, but also to establish a new, better relationship with the Soviet Union and balance one against the other. It was a shrewd act of balance of power diplomacy. Thirdly, I would count among their great achievements was the shuttle diplomacy following the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. Kissinger, particularly in this instance, understood that if you were going to prevent a future all-out war in the Middle East, you needed to establish some greater relationship between Israel and Egypt. And he used the shuttle diplomacy to open the door to that, so that I argue in the book, Jimmy Carter's Camp David peace accords could never have happened without Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy. Now, Kissinger, of course, won the Nobel Peace Prize for Vietnam. Never should have happened. He should have won that Nobel Peace Prize for what he did in the shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East. That, at least, is my wise judgment. Three great achievements: China, détente, shuttle diplomacy. At the same time, though, what you see in these records is an administration that was riddled with deception, backbiting, paranoia, nastiness, viciousness among Nixon and Kissinger, between them and other officials in the government. People have argued that Watergate, it's conventionally accepted, was the issue that brought Nixon down. But I think it really runs deeper than that. Nixon was brought down, I believe, by this aura, this atmosphere of suspicion and deception, which led them into Watergate. Watergate, in a sense, I think, was the symptom, and this deception and manipulation and double-dealing, backbiting, was the cause. Give you a quote from Time magazine, reviewing my book, talking about Nixon and Kissinger. The reviewer said, the two men, they're like twin antediluvian monstrosities. Too ugly, too wonky, too scaly and strange to flourish in today's cold political climate, when the blinding comet of television has wiped out their kind, leaving only furry, grinning mammals behind. They shared power on an unprecedented basis, and it's hypnotic and retroactively terrifying to watch this unsteady Siamese twin act toddling around the globe from China to Chile, Vietnam to the Soviet Union, simultaneously propping each other up and cutting each other down. It's probably better that they're gone, but everybody misses the dinosaurs once in a while. Time magazine. The Nixon-Kissinger relationship I was struck by the fact that when they came together, Nixon really didn't know Kissinger. He had met him once, very briefly, at some cocktail party in New York City. He knew him by reputation. He knew, of course, that he was a distinguished Harvard academic with a track record of having written brilliantly about international affairs, and particularly about national security and nuclear weapons. And Nixon was very eager to control foreign policy. He thought of domestic affairs, he said, as building outhouses in Peoria. He wanted to be, above all, a foreign policy president. And the way he was going to do it was to have a weak Secretary of State, a man named William Rogers, and a weak National Security Advisor, both of whom he could dictate to, push around, tell what to do. Well, he didn't understand what he was getting into when he brought Henry Kissinger on board. He should have known the anecdote that made the rounds at Harvard. Kissinger, one day in the summer, was walking on the campus, and he saw there an aide of his, an assistant in a seminar he was teaching, sitting with a young English woman who was apparently, according to this assistant who gave me this anecdote, was a quite attractive young woman. And Kissinger came up to them, began chatting with them, and was, this man told me, rather flirtatious with this young woman. And she was very cold and standoffish. And he got angry and said to her, "Why don't you like me?" And she said, "Because you're a fascist." And he said, "A fascist? Why, I was in the invasion of Belgium." And she said, "Really? With which army?" Nixon quickly learned that Kissinger was intent on taking power for himself. He was so determined to elbow William Rogers aside, to push him into the background. There was a painful power struggle between the two. Quote from a Nixon telephone conversation, Nixon tape, rather. Talking to Bob Haldeman. Henry's personality problem, Nixon said, is just too goddamn difficult for us to deal with. God damn it, Bob, he's psychopathic about trying to screw Rogers. Haldeman agreed and warned that if Kissinger, quote, wins the battle with Rogers, he may not be livable with afterward. Nixon thought he would become, quote, a dictator. Did you know that Henry worries every time I talk on the telephone with anybody? He feels he must be present anytime I see anybody important. Nixon complained that Kissinger had all these NSC discussions about, quote, every goddamn little shit-ass thing that happens. He has too many meetings. They go on and on and on and on about crap. Our president. A conversation about his national security advisor. Kissinger, Nixon, of course, in some ways, of course, had it right. Kissinger was driven to have as much power as possible. And there's that wonderful anecdote that one day a journalist said to him, Dr. Kissinger, how do you feel about the fact that the American Constitution won't allow you to run for president because you're foreign born? And he said, yes, but it says nothing about my being emperor. When Nixon heard it, he said, how true, how true. You see, he saw it this way. Kissinger was a very difficult man to work for. Al Haig, who was initially his deputy at the National Security Council, described a number of years ago to Walter Isaacson, who wrote a biography of Kissinger, how Henry would come in the room and he would scream and he'd yell and he'd stomp his feet and he would abuse Haig. And then Kissinger would go back in his office and Haig would start walking around the office like some automaton, you see, saluting, you see, making fun of himself for having absorbed this abuse from Kissinger. It was a painful business. Kissinger could be so abusive to his aides. He asked one of them to write a policy paper. And the guy brought it in, put it on his desk. Kissinger writes a message on it. Is this the best you can do? Sends it back. The guy works on it, sends it back in, comes back a second time. Is this the best you can do? Works on it again, sends it back in. Third time it comes back. Is this the best you can do? The guy is angry now. He goes into Kissinger, throws it on his desk. He says, damn it to hell, this is the best I can do. Kissinger says, all right, I'll read it now. He did not endear himself. And in fact, several of his aides at the National Security Council quit before 1 year was out of serving with him. Now Nixon, who could be furious at him because of his assertiveness, Nixon systematically would taunt him. One example. When he was deciding who he was going to send to China, he calls Kissinger in, and we have the tape conversation, the memo. And he says to him, Henry, who do you think I should send? How about Nelson Rockefeller? Now, Rockefeller had been Kissinger's mentor and had really opened the way to his great success in most respects. And Kissinger says, no, Mr. President, he's too undisciplined. And Kissinger and Nixon then says, well, how about George Bush? This is the senior Bush, who then was ambassador to the UN. And Kissinger says, no, he's too soft, much too unsophisticated. And later, in another episode, Kissinger will call him an idiot. Now, whether this will come back to haunt him, I don't know, but I'm sure when Bush 41 sees this, if he hasn't seen it already, it's not going to make him too happy. But that's the way Kissinger could talk about people. Nixon finally decides, yes, he has to send Henry to China because, as Henry says to him, I really know where all the bodies are buried. I've been so close to you, I'm making foreign policy. He agrees to send him. But Nixon was such an insecure and troubled man himself. And he is locked in a battle now with Kissinger over who's going to get the credit for the opening of China. And so when they arrive in China in February of 1972, Kissinger writes in his memoirs that if Nixon told him once, he told him a dozen times, I'm getting off the plane first. You stay in the plane. Nixon didn't even want Pat to come out on the runway or the stairs with him. And so he comes out, smiling, waving to the crowd. There he is, Richard Nixon. He's the one who should get the glamour, the approval for having done this extraordinary thing. Now, in many respects, he deserved it. But he pointedly X's Kissinger out of this because of their painful rivalry. This was a mild example of how he could abuse Kissinger. He would call him behind his back, my Jew boy. And occasionally to his face, he would say, Henry's my Jew boy. And he would say to him ugly things about Jews. And he'd say, isn't that right, Henry? Isn't that right? And Kissinger would supinely reply, well, Mr. President, there are Jews and there are Jews. He would have a meeting with Kissinger, with some other people, about the Middle East. And Kissinger would vent his opinion about what they should do. And Nixon then snidely would say, okay, now can we get an American point of view? His anti-Semitism was really a quality of paranoia, which matched his hatred for the press. If there were two enemies, he saw, Jews and the press. When the My Lai scandal erupted, Nixon on a tape said, this is the consequence of Seymour Hersh, the journalist, a Jew, and he's in cahoots with a bunch of goddamn Jews in New York who are trying to embarrass my administration. This is the level of the paranoia which one could see. Nixon was particularly disquieted during the Yom Kippur War over what Kissinger did. Because at this point, October 73, Nixon is in such despair over the fact that he may be impeached. The Watergate crisis is reaching a crescendo. He's in terrible trouble. The war between Israel and the Arab states erupts, and during the first 3 hours of that conflict, Kissinger is informed that it's going on, but doesn't talk to Nixon. And when he talks to him, actually 3.5 hours after the war, after he'd been informed the war was going on, when he talks to him, Nixon says to him, tell the press that you've been consulting me every half an hour or hour. See, Nixon wants to assure that the press sees him as in control, as an authority. A week after this war began, Brent Scowcroft, who was Kissinger's deputy now at the National Security Council, calls him up and says, Henry, the British Prime Minister, it's 5 to 8 in the evening, British Prime Minister wants to talk to the President in half an hour. And Kissinger says, Brent, we can't do it. He's loaded. He's drunk. And Kissinger says, you tell the Prime Minister to talk to him in the morning, and in the meantime, I'll talk to him. See? Most disquieting of all, 2 weeks later, the Egyptian Third Army is surrounded in the Sinai. There's been an alleged ceasefire agreement, but the Israelis are apparently violating it, and there's a lot of anxiety on the part of the Soviets, who've been supplying the Egyptians, that the Third Army is going to be forced to resign. And the Soviets send a message to Kissinger that they want to send a military contingent, a paratroop brigade, into the Sinai. And they ask Kissinger for the United States to join them in this military initiative. Kissinger and Haig have a conversation in which they agree this is not going to happen. They will not let the Soviets get in there. Haig says to Kissinger, you're going to meet to talk about this. Where are you meeting? And Kissinger says at the State Department. And Haig says, no, you must meet at the President's house, at the White House, to show that it's Nixon who's in charge. And Kissinger says to him, well, Al, where's the President? And Haig says, he's asleep. It's 10 to 10 in the evening. He's asleep. And Kissinger says, well, should we wake him up? And Haig says, no. Remember, I'm in charge here. Well, they don't wake him up. A half an hour later, Kissinger and Haig speak again. And Haig says to Kissinger, because they never trust each other, Haig says to him, well, did you talk to the president? And Kissinger says, no, I don't want him charging around here. They then go ahead, 7 officials, none of whom had been elected to anything. And they raise the defense condition, the nuclear alert. Only twice during the Cold War did this happen. First, when John Kennedy was in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then during this Yom Kippur War. 7 unelected officials. The next day, Kissinger talks to Al Haig after the Soviets, in response to this threat of American nuclear power. The Soviets cave in, and the first person Nixon or Kissinger talks to is not Nixon, but Haig. And Haig says to him, well, have you talked to the president yet? And Kissinger says, no, I'll call him in half an hour. And when he calls him up, he says to him, Mr. President, you've won again. Now Nixon, who has been so out of this, what is he going to do? Fire Kissinger for doing this? Instead, he congratulates him and says, Henry, great job. Because in a sense, Nixon can get some credit for this, or the lion's share of the credit. He's forced the Soviets to back down. This infuriated Nixon. Even more so, he didn't know about the fact when Nixon or Kissinger began on his shuttle diplomacy that Kissinger would send back cables to Haig and Scowcroft in which he would say, if you think this information will unnerve or disturb the president, don't show it to him. He's taking over. He's running foreign policy. Now, General Brent Scowcroft, who I interviewed, told me that Nixon would complain to him repeatedly about the way in which Kissinger was taking away power. The night before Nixon resigns, he has a conversation with his successor, Gerald Ford. And he says to him, Jerry, you've got to keep Henry on. He's absolutely essential to our national security, to our diplomacy. But every once in a while, you've got to kick him in the nuts, because otherwise he'll run away with power. Nixon to Ford. Kissinger, in seeing all this, did not sit by quietly. Behind the scenes, he would talk to people about the president. Nixon would call up, and he'd put his hand over the mouthpiece, and he'd say to the person listening in on the phone, it's our drunken friend calling. He called him the meatball mind. He had a conversation with Bernard Kalb, the diplomatic correspondent for CBS, and he told Kalb, you don't understand. I'm sorry, Marvin Kalb. Marvin, you don't understand. He's a madman. They're crazy. It's impossible. The burden I have to shoulder dealing with these people. Now, Kalb told me he would say these things, not saying off the record, but say it in a way that would ingratiate himself with the press. And I read so many of these conversations he has with the press in which he is ingratiating himself, and he is creating a kind of rapport with them, which serves his public image, but he so demeans them. And when he talks about the people around Nixon, he told the British ambassador, and I found this in British documents, he told the British ambassador, these people around Nixon are the biggest bunch of crooks and bastards I've ever seen. They're the greatest bunch of heels I've ever dealt with. So the indiscretion really quite amazed me, really quite surprised me. At the same time, they would engage in the most overt flattery with each other. Nixon would say to Henry, great job, brilliant action. And Kissinger, I quote to you one conversation. In June of '73, during the Watergate crisis, Kissinger told Nixon about the Democratic senators pressing the Watergate investigation, quote, these bastard traitors we have in this country, these bastards are now trying to deprive you of any success, Mr. President. When Nixon said he had no plan to resign, Kissinger responded, quote, a resignation would be a national catastrophe. You can go down in history as the man who brought about the greatest revolution in foreign policy ever. And he would say things to him like, Mr. President, without you, this country would be dead. See? So the two-faced quality that went on in this administration. What I find most striking, though, is the fact that not only was there this rivalry, but that they were also partners in what I would call partners in deception. Two things, Vietnam and Chile. Vietnam was a disaster. 23,000 American troops and tens of thousands of Vietnamese died during the 4 years of the Nixon first term. They knew that this war was a failure. The conversation they have in 1969, in which Nixon says to Kissinger, there are some of the military in Vietnam who think we can succeed. We can't. We cannot win this war. They're absolutely convinced of that. And yet, they tell the public, we can win. Nixon gives repeated speeches in which he talks about staying the course, the necessity for America to do what it has to do in order to assure South Vietnamese autonomy. Vietnamization. Nixon argued to the public that as we stand down, and he was withdrawing the troops. We had 545,000 troops when he came to office. By the time the 72 election came along, there were 39,000 left. The formula was Vietnamization. They'll take over the fighting. In 1971, there's an invasion of Laos. The North Vietnamese are pouring in supplies and men, and Nixon and Kissinger, the American government, urges the South Vietnamese to go in and battle North Vietnamese in Laos. They get their head handed to them. And Nixon has a conversation with national security advisors in which he says, he curses them. He's furious. If only they would take one goddamn hill. If only they would capture a couple of prisoners. They don't use their air force to bomb the North Vietnamese trucks because Nixon says they're moving targets. And he says, what the hell is wrong with them? And he just is furious. But he knows that this Vietnamization is a failure. In addition to that, they revealed to the Soviets and the Chinese that they have no real hope of winning this war. Kissinger told Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador, that in essence, what the United States needs is a decent interval. If we get out and the North Vietnamese give us a year and a half, at the end of that time, if they commit a new act of aggression or if they strike against South Vietnamese and topple that South Vietnamese government, we're not going to go back in. Give us a decent interval. And he tells the same thing to Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier. A year and a half is what they're looking for. When the war is winding down, Nixon says, we've achieved peace with honor. The historian Larry Berman has written a book called Neither Peace Nor Honor, and I think he had it right. In fact, there's a conversation Nixon and Kissinger have in which Kissinger tells Nixon, as he's about to give his speech announcing the peace accord, do not, Mr. President, describe it as lasting, because he understands that this is not going to last all that long, that the South Vietnamese are not likely to be able to stand up to the North Vietnamese for that long. Why do they stay with this war? Why didn't they end it in 1969? They could have put a fig leaf on our defeat at that time, just as much as they could have in 1972 or 73. Kissinger had a conversation with the journalist Stuart Alsop. In the course of this conversation, Kissinger said the president was engaged in a sleight-of-hand performance comparable to de Gaulle's action in ending the Algerian War. Henry called de Gaulle a great illusionist who had staged a retreat from North Africa in a way that made France look more powerful than it actually was. Alsop said, and I quote, I've compared Nixon on Vietnam to the Wizard of Oz, his great clouds of rhetoric designed to conceal the fact that he has embarked on the greatest retreat in history. Kissinger agreed, saying the trick is to stage a great retreat and emerge at the other end still a great power, reasonably cohesive at home. fool the public. Tell them that this is a peace with honor. Now, at one level, I don't fault that so much because, you know, for us to have walked out of there and said, well, we've been defeated and all those 58,700 lives were wasted, seems to me to have been unacceptable. You had to put some proper face on your departure. They did not get out in '69 because they kept saying, if we get out too soon, it will undermine America's credibility with adversaries and allies. Huge mistake. They have a conversation with de Gaulle in February of '69, and they point this out to de Gaulle. They emphasize this idea of credibility, and de Gaulle says to them, I thought the credibility problem was with your enemies, not with you, see. If we had gotten out of Vietnam in '69, in fact, I think it would have enhanced rather than undermined America's credibility. Of course, people would have said, other nations, governments, diplomats would have said, we are now seeing the reality that we're not winning in Vietnam, we're not going to win in Vietnam, and the Americans have decided to get out of there and use their resources on more constructive things, in more constructive ways. But instead, they keep talking about credibility, and it seems to me to have been a terrible mistake. The other great disaster which they perpetrated, I think, was in Chile. Because the minute Salvador Allende won the election, he won only 34% of the vote for the presidency. The tradition in Chile was that the Congress put into power someone who had a plurality rather than a majority. So there was nothing here running against their democratic tradition in Chile. Nixon and Kissinger try as hard as they can to block his accession to power. When that failed, and he gained the presidency, they worked as hard as they could to topple him, using propaganda, supplying money through the CIA, cutting off financial aid from the International Monetary Fund, from the World Bank. And so when the government of Chile fell in 1973, Nixon and Kissinger denied that they had anything to do with it. This was the public posture, which Nixon, or Kissinger rather, continues to this day. Here's a conversation he has with Nixon. He recorded, transcript, when Allende falls. Quote, the Chilean thing is getting consolidated, and of course newspapers are bleeding because a pro-communist government has been overthrown, Kissinger said, told Nixon. Isn't that something, Nixon responded. Kissinger then said, instead of celebrating, why in the Eisenhower period, we would be heroes. Nixon interjected, well, we didn't, as you know. Our hand doesn't show on this one, though. Kissinger responded, we didn't do it. I mean, we helped them, created the conditions as great as possible. That's right, Nixon said. Now, this is their acknowledgement of the fact. I'm not saying that they authorized the coup when it occurred, that they authorized Allende's death, but they were decisively behind this effort. And so what you get is this kind of deception. To conclude, James Madison said that presidents often tell the public what they want to hear. They should tell them what they need to know, what they need in order to allow them to become more realistic about the country's public affairs. But all too often, I'm afraid, presidents practice a kind of deception. Now, this is not all bad. No president is ever going to be entirely forthright with the press, with the public. This is part of our democratic political system. But the judgment I think the historian can make is whether the deception has been used in the service of some constructive policy over the long haul, as opposed to a policy that proves to be a terrible mistake. FDR during World War II was highly suspicious of the Soviet Union, but the public mood was such that he could not reveal in any honest way to the public his suspicions about them. He hides the suspicions when he and Churchill meet at Quebec at Hyde Park in 1944, and they sign an aid memoir in which they agree they'll hold back the secret of the atomic bomb from Stalin. This was so at variance with the picture that Roosevelt was painting in public, because he was responding to the fact that in Life magazine, Henry Luce painted a picture of the Soviets, famous article in which he said, the Soviets are just like us, they dress like us, they think like us, they act like us, they even have an NKVD, which is just like our FBI. Wendell Willkie, who ran against Roosevelt in 1940, published a book in 1943 called One World, which was a fantasy. He describes how he meets with Stalin and he says to him, Premier Stalin, you're educating your people so well in the elements of democracy that you're going to educate yourself right out of a job. And he says, Stalin laughed heartily, as well he might have, this naive American. Ridiculous. But Roosevelt saw that the public wanted to believe that the Soviets were becoming like us, that they were abandoning communism, they were going to become friendly to the United States, we were going to have a love fest with them as far into the future as anyone could see. Well, this was a false picture he painted. But he did it because the public, he felt, would revert to isolationism if he did not convince them that at the end of the war there was going to be international cooperation. He felt it was too dangerous to tell the public the truth about the possibility of an oncoming Cold War. In order to move the country from isolationism to internationalism, he presses this point. So his deception, it seems to me, was at least in the service of something constructive, as opposed to what Nixon and Kissinger did in Vietnam and Chile. Let me stop here, because if I start talking about current events, I think, as I end the book, I say, this book, I hope, will be seen as a cautionary tale. See, Michio Kakutani in the New York Times reviewed the book, and she said, Mr. Dallek does not speak openly about this, but that it is an oblique point of reference. The book is a kind of oblique point of reference to the Iraq War. And she's absolutely right. Who could resist? Who could ignore these current events? Nobody writes a work of history without some influence of current events on them. Your mind is always turning over what is going on at the moment. Hopefully, you are nevertheless committed to an honest assessment of the past, but you are always influenced by present events. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you. One of your books, you mentioned that Moscow had been telling Washington after World War II that they're going to aid and assist any third world nation, that had been held under Eurocentric European colonialism, and to help them give them a boost toward self-determination. How much of a component was that idea of antagonism to the Cold War? Was that the Cold War? The basis of the Cold War, or a significant component?
Well, it was certainly a component, but my feeling is, as far as the Cold War goes, I think it was inevitable. Because we had two such diametrically opposed systems, socially, politically, economically, historically, and this idea that we were going to get along with the Soviets for as far into the future as anyone could see was an illusion. And there was a power vacuum. The Soviets came in to fill it. The British, the French could no longer. There was no Germany to speak of. France was so weakened, and so the United States comes in to fill that power vacuum. And so they butt up against each other. The great, I think, ultimately redeeming feature of the Cold War is that it never turned into a full-scale hot war with the Soviet Union. And I think that's why it's so interesting to me. Harry Truman, he leaves office in 1953. His approval rating is down to 32% because of the frustration over the Korean War. And now he's seen as one of the near great presidents of American history. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we win the Cold War, and that Truman, Kennan, the containment doctrine is seen as having been very wise, very effective, and that it was at the center of what allows us to win the Cold War. Patience, wait them out. Their system is so ineffective, they're so inept, that eventually it's going to collapse. And Kennan was absolutely right. And Truman went along with that. And this is, I think, the reason why Harry Truman now enjoys such a wonderful reputation. The current president likes to say he'll be like Harry Truman. Yes, now his approval rating is down to 28%, but that in the long run, he'll be seen as a kind of Harry Truman figure who did the right thing and was very wise. Tell this anecdote, I did an interview for this book with Charlie Rose the other night, and he taped it, and the day before he had interviewed President Bush. And so he said to me, Professor, he said, the president says he's going to be vindicated by history. So I smiled, and I said, Charlie, I said, let me be pretentious. I'm a historian. I'm the voice of history. And I'm telling you, he's dead wrong. Yeah. I'm hoping they're going to play it as part. They've not played the interview yet, but we'll see. And if I get assassinated after that, you'll know who did it. Yes.
Is there any substance that Henry Kissinger thought of Nixon himself as a Count Otto von Bismarck?
The king. There is a substance to it in that he was and remains a kind of real politician, but he is a brilliant operator, very effective politician. He understood that during the Watergate crisis, there was a vacuum there of authority, and he was filling it. And he sort of all the people who came out of that Nixon administration who did not suffer, you see, a blight of reputation. Nixon does, and John Dean, and Haldeman, and Ehrlichman, and John Mitchell, and you can just go through Agnew, you go through the roster of all those people, but not Kissinger. Because, in a sense, he understood that the country's national security needed defending, and he was the one who sort of took that burden on. And but he was a Machiavellian, he was a real politician, he was a Bismarckian, balance of power diplomacy. And he would say things like, if there's a contest between some moral question and, realpolitik, he opts for realpolitik every time. See? And so on Chile, he might tell you that this was necessary. But we'll be, as I said earlier, history is argument without end. We'll be arguing about this forever. Was it necessary? My conviction is Allende would have fallen of his own accord. He was very ineffective. And the economy of Chile was in lousy shape, in significant part because of what we did. But he was not terribly effective, and he probably would have fallen. Of course, they were so frightened by the example of Cuba and Castro, and fearful that communism, radicalism would spread across the Western Hemisphere throughout Latin America. But I think they overreacted terribly. And there is a very substantial documentary record now revealing what they did in relation to Chile. So he can bob and weave on that, and he can make his case that it was good real politics, but I just don't think it's the case. Yes?
Professor, I know I may be getting you into trouble with this question, but I'm afraid I can't resist. There's been great talk recently of the relationship between Henry Kissinger and the current administration, and whether or not, and suggested by many that there have been many conversations between Mr. Kissinger and the Bush administration. I'm curious as to whether or not you see any traces or fingerprints of Kissinger on the current policy of the administration, and what you make of this relationship.
It's a wonderful question, and historians are going to be asking that in the future. We're going to be wrestling with this for a very long time to come. It's going to be probably 30 or 40 years before we can get at the records of what, and if they're there. You see, we don't have telephone conversations anymore. We don't have tapes, but maybe these emails, I'm praying, I'm hoping, that these emails will because, when we do emails, you write so casually and ungrammatically, and it'd be great if these emails are available to us. But I do see Kissinger's fingerprints. It's conceivable that he says to him things about how difficult it is to struggle effectively in Iraq or win this war, but that, Mr. President, you can't just walk away from this. You've got to stay the course. And of course, it then confirms what Bush wants, because somehow Bush operates by this sort of evangelical nonsense, this sort of Wilsonian proposition that we can spread democracy across that region. I mean, I find it so unconvincing, so lacking in realism, in good sense. See, Professor Hart and I have talked about this repeatedly. This guy's not a conservative. I mean, I don't know what he is exactly. An opportunist? But it's so sad for the country. I mean, I feel terribly. There are now 3,372 American troops have been killed. And when you read those stories in the New York Times about what's been going on in Iraq, it is so awful. Their lives have been so blighted. What is it? 3 million people have already fled the country. Medical services, trained people, physicians are fleeing that country as fast as they can get out of there. It's just such a tragedy. And they won't back away from this. It's just, so this is going to be quite a struggle, because he won't get out, and it's going to take the next administration to do it. And it's going to be a really tricky problem, such as Nixon, in a sense, faced. He's going to have to find some way, the next president, he or she, is going to have to find some way to peace with honor. Yes, sir.
Much like Kissinger, the current Secretary of State comes from a background in academia. I was wondering if you see any parallels between the way that, for both of them, their academic backgrounds kind of shape their view towards policymaking.
Without question. I don't think it could be otherwise. But what I find interesting is that the kind of bureaucratic infighting that goes on in universities, I think also has shaped some of their experience in office. It's not as if they come to these jobs as babes in the wood. They've seen some pretty, the famous, Kissinger's famous saying, the fighting was always so fierce at Harvard because the stakes were so small. See? But the stakes are large in these government offices, but they are shaped by, I don't mean just the bureaucratic infighting, but by their thinking, by their writings, by their deliberations about what should go into foreign policy. But what puzzles me is that for all the so-called quote-unquote realism that one thinks that they propagate and propose and push, you see it falling away when they get into authority. Somehow they fall, on bended knee in the presence of the president. I've talked to some people who've said to me, I went in to see the president, not necessarily this president, other presidents, well, Clinton, other earlier presidents. I went in to see him, and I was going to tell him, and then they melted. Because being in that Oval Office I was there once, not to advise, but just visiting, and it is a very intimidating business to try and start. I had a friend who was a journalist and was in Cuba during the Bay of Pigs operation, and he was jailed by Castro, and he came out, and he told me that his resolve, a man named Henry Raymond, who was a New York Times, later New York Times Latin American specialist, Henry said, he came out, Kennedy invited him to come to see him. And he said he was going in there loaded to tell Kennedy, what a stupid thing you did. That invasion was such a mistake. But he said he got in there, and Kennedy was so full of self-recrimination already, he said he couldn't bring himself to pile on. And he just nodded and kind of stroked Kennedy, you see. So, it takes, I think, a certain kind of courage to do that. Jeffrey.
Can you comment on the scene where Pat Shelley Buchanan are with Nixon? He asks him about the future of Israel. He says short-term or long-term. They say one says long-term. And he turns thumbs down on it.
Yes.
Does he mean there are just too many Arabs or something like that?
Well, I think he meant too many Arabs, but he was also very irritated by his dealings with the Israelis because they were extremely difficult to deal with. He found them, in fact, Nixon's approach to the whole Middle East through the first 3 years of his presidency is to put it on the shelf. He understands this is a kind of miasma, cauldron. He's not going to be able to get much done. And so his attitude is, let's not touch it. We've got so many bigger fish to fry. We've got to deal with Vietnam. We've got to get the opening of China. We've got to get détente with the Soviet Union. Then he has the India-Pakistan war. So all these things take priority. But then the Yom Kippur War comes along, and his conviction was that the Israelis, in some ways, were their own worst enemies, that they were so unbending. And he thought that at some point the Arabs would catch up with them and would destroy Israel. See, so I think that was his, thumbs down for the long term. Yes.
Welcome back, Professor.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, thinking about the way Congress responded to Nixon, the War Powers Act, and other things, and who the candidates for 08 are, do you see any way the next Congress can rein in a lot of the powers this president has extended?
It's a wonderful question. And there is a commission which James Baker, coming out of Rice University, is involved in. Deliberations. They've asked me to say something about it or to testify before them. And I've been mulling this over, and I'm not sure what to say, because we've had the imperial presidency. We're back to the imperial presidency. We're back to a point that we've gotten ourselves into a war that has now become fiercely unpopular. There is not, of course, the outpouring of opposition and dissent and marches in the streets the way there was over Vietnam. And that, of course, I believe is largely because there's no draft. Think of all you students, male and female, because if there were a draft this time, women would go as well, or be called up as well, I believe. But how do you rein in presidential power? It is the most difficult question, I think, about executive authority that we face these days. Because whenever there is the feeling that there's a threat to the country, the public focuses on the chief executive. He's the one you turn to. He's the defender. He's our only nationally elected official. You're not going to turn to Nancy Pelosi or Harry Reid. You're not going to turn to somebody in the Congress per se. But if things get bad enough, then of course the Congress does assert itself and try to rein in the president's war powers. And so it's a constant struggle. It's part of the system that the founding fathers set up to begin with about balancing one branch of government against the other. And there are periods when one branch gets too much power, and then periods when another branch sort of eclipses that branch. But it's a back and forth. It's sort of like the Fourth Estate, the press constantly jousting with presidents. There's never going to be a honeymoon between presidents and press, because there's a kind of natural antagonism. So I think you'll see ongoing antagonism, but I think the consequence of this immediate consequence of this Iraq war will be a substantial effort to rein in the executive next time. And I think that if this war is continuing, I think the likelihood is very great that the Democrats will win both the White House and the Congress. But then, will a Democratic Congress want to rein in the powers of a Democratic president? That's yet another consideration. Thomas Jefferson said that to assure our liberties, there must be constant vigilance. And Harry Truman said, the greatest title anyone has in this country is not president or senator or judge or congressman, it's citizen. And that's our obligation, and especially as educated people, to pay attention, to do what we can to make the system work as well as it can. And it's always an argument. It's going to go on forever. And it's a constant challenge. It's never over. It will be going on for years and decades and through your lifetimes. I sometimes selfishly say, I wish I could come back in 100 or 200 years. I'd love to see what's happened to this country, because there will be constant struggle. Bruce.
Forgive me, you say there's never a honeymoon between the president and the press, but I would say there certainly was a honeymoon. I think you would agree with me, really, in the run-up to the Iraq War.
Well, I should say,
They never get a free pass from the press in that way.
yeah, there's never a permanent or a constant. I should have added that qualifier. Yeah, I mean, at times, they do a lousy job at times, just as the president does a lousy job at times, just as Congress. The only ones who never do a lousy job are historians.
Questions. One is, clearly the Nixon presidency was a flawed presidency.
Yes.
The individuals were flawed, the administration was flawed, but at least looking back, they did, as you mentioned, have certainly several very good foreign policy initiatives.
Yep.
What is, so first question is, as it relates to the current administration, and if you could predict, as a historian 30 years in the future, looking back, can you see anything that this administration will be proud of? The second question is, I know you've been on a number of the TV shows. Which of the talking heads that you've had the pleasure or displeasure of talking with do you think actually do a good job?
To answer your first question first, I agree with you. I'm very hard-pressed to see what future historians are going to say that will be so positive about this administration. Now, I'm very biased. I mean, I'm very offended by this guy. I'm really put off by him. And so it's hard for me to offer some objective judgment and say, well, you know, there is Katrina, Alberto Gonzalez, the great achievements we had in Iraq. I mean, what can one point to? I don't know. It's No Child Left Behind, which seems to be falling on its face. It's distressing. I think this guy will go down as one of the real bottom feeders of the presidency. I mean, in a league with some of the least successful of our presidents. And I don't know what he is thinking when he says, you know, the future will vindicate him. I guess he thinks that somehow or other he'll be like Truman, but where's his containment doctrine? What's his larger proposition as to how we deal with these international dangers? Preemption? This has failed in Iraq. It's not a real policy. It doesn't have substance to it, the way containment did. So I'm hard-pressed to believe that he can be seen as very successful. The second part of your question, I would say, I've enjoyed the interviews on television the most with the Jim Lehrer NewsHour, with Judy Woodruff or Margaret Warner or with Jim himself. And on radio, my favorites are the folks at the NPR Morning Edition or All Things Considered. I really think those are the best news outlets in the country and give you the most authoritative and realistic assessment of what's going on. And I mean, again, they're not perfect, and sometimes I watch that Lehrer NewsHour and I feel they're throwing softballs at some of these folks they interview. But it's a lot better than, but the ones I like least, to conclude, are when the networks come over, and they'll come to my house, and they say, oh, we've got this topic, we want to interview you. And I say, okay, come on over. They come over, sit down in my living room, and bring in the camera crew, spend a half an hour setting up, and then they'll interview me for 20 minutes. And then I'll turn it on that night, NBC News. And then they say, we asked Professor Dallek, and they'll flash on me, and I say, well, yes. Such are the depths of my wisdom. You see. I mean, so that, you know, it's not even a soundbite. You know, go ahead.
I'm curious, after looking at Roosevelt and Truman and a bunch of presidents who have all taken kind of these quasi-legal actions, when do presidents get away with breaking the law, and when do they get in trouble for it, since Nixon got nailed for burglary and not bombing Cambodia?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, because why do so many of the congressmen, senators, get away with so much as well? And I think it partly has to do with the fact that so few of them are ever brought down. And so they feel it gives them a kind of license to cross the line, to do things that might deserve to be brought into the courts and have them prosecuted. But it's very difficult for prosecutors to go after a very high official. See, I mean, how is this guy Gonzalez surviving? He's the Attorney General of the United States. And, you know, people are saying, these senators who questioned him, they say it's transparent that you know, what are we talking about here? He obscures, he obfuscates, and yet he's still there. And now, has he committed crimes? Has he broken the law? I don't know. I'm no attorney. But you dig deep enough, you're probably going to find other ugly things. I mean, as Winston Churchill said, and I always quote this, democracy is the worst possible system, except for all the rest. So it's flawed, but what else? Yes, ma'am.
You kind of touched on this about Nixon knowing that the Vietnam War was not winnable.
Yes.
We know now from tapes that LBJ knew that he was crawling into a really deep hole. I really thought that Nixon would end the war and say those bozos didn't know how to do it.
Right.
Why couldn't he do it? Almost half the deaths were after he came in, correct?
Yeah.
24,000. What was it in his psyche, or, I know he didn't want to be seen as a loser, but couldn't he have said, I have a plan, slowly we'll get out because they messed it up, I would have won it?
Three things, your point. He said, I'm not going to be the first president in United States history to be known as the president who lost the war. Second thing was the credibility issue that I mentioned before. And the third thing was the illusion that we could use military power to really force them to the peace table in to make a more effective, acceptable peace. And so you get the Cambodian incursion, and you get the offensive into Laos, and you get the Christmas bombing. Now, it does wreak terrible havoc on them and does cause terrible suffering and loss. But they couldn't do it. It didn't work. And so, you know, 2 years later, 1975, the North Vietnamese gobble up South Vietnam. And sure, it's retrospective thinking, but how much better it would have been, as I've said, if we got out in '69. What would we have lost? And also the fact that at the end of the day, so South Vietnam goes communist. All those predictions about the dominoes will fall, American credibility will be injured, it may lead to a third world war. It's all wrong, dead wrong. And the outcome is we win the Cold War anyway. Did it matter that Vietnam went communist? And now, you know, both sides cozy up to each other about economic relations and trade. I mean, it just shows you, I am so skeptical of the predictions that these politicians make, that their assessments of the future. Sometimes they're right, but most of the time, they're way off base. And so I'm a great skeptic about what they say and do. Yes, sir.
Don't mind me, one more. Given that the containment policy and all that, the motivation for Southeast Asia, and also if you go back to the brothers Dallek and look at the papers about protecting access to tin, rubber, oil, and everything. And in one of your books, even Cardinal Spellman got JFK in there and try to get him to back there because Catholic Church had a lot of his real estate holdings in South Vietnam.
Yep.
Those things I threw out there and all this
Sure.
stuff. You know, how does it come together?
Well,
Or does it?
that's the question. Does it? Does it? I mean, there is a kind of underlying mood, attitude, Weltanschauung, as the Germans put it, world perspective, and an era. President Wright was saying this evening at dinner that there's such a striking difference between what went on with the Cold War and what went on with Iraq, that with Vietnam, you could kind of understand there was almost something inevitable about it, the way in which we were heading in the Cold War and the whole mood and attitude and perspective. And Iraq, though, comes much more out of the blue. And so, I mean, I know a number of people who argue that the reason we're in Iraq is because we want permanent military bases there. The reason we're in Iraq is because of oil. Now, maybe there are elements of truth to that. Certainly this Kellogg, Halliburton. I mean, God, they've wreaked a fortune off this war. It's disgraceful. It's deeply, deeply troubling. So, but how much influence do they really have? I think at bottom, these presidents, at bottom, what pains me most is to watch what I call the auto-intoxication. They talk themselves into things. I'm right. The Lord is on my side. Tell the last anecdote. President in the 19th century, Benjamin Harrison, lost to Grover Cleveland by 100,000 votes, won the electoral vote, and he became president. And he said, Providence dictated that I should become president. And there was a Republican boss from Pennsylvania by the name of Matthew Quay, and he said, Providence indeed. If only the man knew how many people had to approach the gates of the penitentiary to put him in that office. Enough said.